American English Oakhaven, August 1882, and Declan had just thrown a man into the dirt right in front of her. Let's see what a pretty widow like you does with a piece of human trash. Eva didn't look at him. She walked straight down, knelt beside the man in the dust, and asked, voice steady as iron, "Can you push with your arms?" Lorcan looked up at her, waiting for the cruelty that always came next. It didn't come. They thought she was taking in a burden. They were wrong. This is the story of Eva and Lorcan. Stay with me to watch them build an empire. Oakhaven had a long memory and a short conscience. The town sat baking under the August sun. Its main street, a strip of bleached wood and cracked earth, its people going about their business with the particular cruelty of those who believe gossip is a public service. They talked about Eva Sterling, the way they talked about bad weather constantly and with great satisfaction. The widow on the ridge. That was what they called her. Not by her name, not with any warmth. Just that phrase loaded with everything they wanted it to mean. Her husband, Gerald Sterling, had died on their wedding night. A horse threw him in the dark, and that what was that? 1 hour a husband, then gone. Eva had been 18 years old, standing in a wedding dress, waiting for a man who never came back through the door. The town should have offered her kindness. Instead, they offered her a label, Jinx, because that was easier than feeling sorry for her. She was 24 now, and she had learned to live with the whispers. She worked her 40 acres alone, rose before the sun, cooked over a fire she built herself, and spoke to no one in town unless business required it. She was striking in a way that made people uncomfortable, a face that stopped conversation, a figure that drew eyes whether she wanted it to or not, and a dignity about her that somehow offended those who had none. People resented beauty when it refused to be decorative. Eva refused every day. Senator Thaddeus Vance did not resent her beauty. He wanted it. He also wanted her land, but in the way men like him operate, those two desires lived in the same dark room. He was a wide man with small eyes and a habit of touching things that didn't belong to him. And for 2 years, he had been circling Eva's homestead the way a vulture circles, something that isn't dead yet. He had tried gifts. She had returned them. He had tried the law. Her deed was clean. He had tried charm. She had looked through him like glass. So he tried something else. Lorcan Prescott arrived on Eva's porch the way a piece of furniture arrives when someone doesn't want it anymore, dropped, abandoned, and facing the wrong direction. He had been a scout once, a mining engineer before that. A man who had mapped fault lines in 3 territories and could read the geology of a hillside the way a preacher reads scripture. Then a grizzly bear had found him in the Montana backcountry, and what the bear left behind was the lower half of his body still attached, still present, but gone in every practical sense. The damage to his spine had been total. He had not walked in 4 years. Declan Brooks drove the wagon that brought him. Declan was Vance's man through and through, a foreman, with a hired gun's instincts and a bully's timing. He pulled up to Eva's front gate, with 2 of Vance's ranch hands riding behind him and Lorcan in the wagon bed, propped against the sideboard like something being transported. Lorcan's clothes were filthy. His jaw was dark with a week's growth of beard. His hands, still powerful, still scarred from years of fieldwork, rested on his thighs with no particular purpose. Declan didn't even stop the wagon fully before he shoved him. Lorcan went over the side and hit the dirt face first. He made no sound. He lay still for a moment, then turned himself over slowly, using his arms, and sat himself up out of the dust with the careful economy of a man who has had to recalculate every movement his body makes. Declan swung down from the wagon seat and put a boot on the fence post. "Let's see what a pretty widow like you does with a piece of human trash," he said. He wasn't even looking at Lorcan when he said it. He was looking at Eva. She had come out onto the porch at the sound of wagon wheels. She stood in the doorway with a dish rag in her hand and her dark hair pinned back from her face. Her expression did not change. Not at the words, not at the men, not at the figure in the dirt. She looked at Declan for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked past him. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and crouched in the dirt next to Lorcan. Up close, she could see the wound in him, not the physical damage, but the other kind. The kind that comes from being treated like he had just been treated, over and over, until a man starts to believe it. "Can you push with your arms?" she said. Her voice was steady. Lorcan looked at her. He was visibly bracing for the pity, or the revulsion, or the performance of goodwill that is somehow worse than both. She just looked back at him. "Patient, yes," he said. "Then push. I'll brace your back." She got behind him and planted her feet and put her hands under his arms, and together they worked him upright. It took a full minute. She didn't hurry it. She didn't wince. When he was sitting up straight and had his breath, she moved around to face him. "I've got a chair inside," she said. "It's plain, but it holds weight. We'll get you into it." Lorcan said nothing. He was still watching her face for the thing that was going to come, the look, the word, the gentle cruelty dressed up as sympathy. It didn't come. Behind them, Declan made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Enjoy your charity case, Mrs. Sterling." Eva did not turn around. "Get off my property," she said. Flat final. Declan lingered another moment, the way such men do, wanting the last word, finding he didn't have one, and then he swung back up onto the wagon and left. She made him a meal first. He sat in the wooden chair by the window, hands folded, and watched her move around the small kitchen. The cabin was plain, but kept with precision. Everything had a place. The tools hanging by the door were sorted by size. The jars on the shelf were labeled in a careful hand. Order everywhere. The kind that comes not from ease, but from discipline. She set cornbread and beans in front of him and sat across the table. "I don't have a name for what the arrangement would be," she said. "I don't need charity, and I imagine you don't either. I need a second pair of hands. You've still got those." Lorcan looked down at the food, then back at her. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "I know. Declan Brooks dropped you here to embarrass me," she said. "That tells me he considers you a problem. That's enough to start with." A silence passed between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. "Lorcan Prescott," he said. "Eva Sterling." He ate. She waited until he was done before she said anything else, because she understood that a man who has been hungry has no real appetite for conversation until that more urgent thing is handled. "The back room has a cot," she said. "The door's wide enough if we take it off its hinges. I'll need to cut a board for a ramp at the step. I can tell you the measurements," he said. I assumed. He looked at her again with those watchful eyes, dark, careful eyes that had spent years reading the earth for hidden things. "Why?" he said. "Not, why are you helping me?" The word was bigger than that, and she knew it. She thought about it honestly. "Because they intended it as an insult," she said, "to both of us, and I'm tired of accepting what men like that intend for me." Lorcan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, outside, the August heat pressed down on Oakhaven with no mercy, and the town kept on talking the way it always did. They would hear about this, and they would add it to their list of things to say about Eva Sterling, the widow, on the ridge. Let them. She went to the tool shed to find her saw and measure out a board for the ramp. She had a cot to prepare, a door to rehang, and 40 acres that needed tending before dark. She did not think about Senator Vance's small, hungry eyes. She did not think about the look on Declan's face when he said trash. She thought about the set of shoulders on the man in her kitchen, the quiet, compressed dignity of someone who has been broken in one way and has refused, entirely, to be broken in any other. Oakhaven thought it had handed her a burden. She thought it had made a very serious miscalculation. The first 3 days were mostly silence, not the cold kind, not the hostile kind, just the silence of two people who don't yet know what to do with each other, moving carefully around the edges of a shared space, learning the rhythms. Lorcan woke before Eva each morning. She discovered this on the second day when she came out of her room to find the fire already built up and a pot of water heating on the grate. He had his back to her, sitting in the wooden chair, with a worn notebook open across his knee, writing something in a hand so small and precise. It looked like typeset print. He didn't acknowledge her right away. Not from rudeness, she could see that. He was finishing a thought. He crossed something out, wrote it again, and then looked up. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. She stood there a moment longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she said, and went to wash her face. She spent that morning hauling water from the well to the garden, 2 heavy buckets at a time, the yoke across her shoulders, pressing into muscle that had long since gotten used to the weight. The garden was the only thing between her and a very difficult winter. She knew that. She worked it accordingly. From the porch, Lorcan watched. He didn't say anything until the 4th trip. "That yoke's too wide for your shoulders," he said. "It's built for a man with broader bones. You're losing half your stability on the turn." She set the buckets down and looked at him. "It's the only yoke I have," she said. "I know," he held up the notebook. He had already sketched something. "I can cut it down and re-shoulder it in an afternoon if you've got spare timber." She had spare timber. She told him where it was. By sundown, the yoke was modified and hanging on its peg, and Eva carried the same load on the next morning's run with 30% less effort. She didn't make a production of noticing, but she noticed. That was how it began between them, not with grand gestures, with small, practical offerings of respect. Lorcan's shame was quieter than Eva expected. She had been prepared for bitterness, she understood it. Had seen it in men who'd lost less, but Lorcan's wound ran deeper than bitterness. It was more like grief. He mourned the version of himself that had moved freely through mountain passes and river valleys, reading the land under his feet, and he had not yet made full peace with the version that remained. She caught glimpses of it when he thought she wasn't watching. The way he'd reach for something and then stop, recalculate, approach it from a different angle. The way his jaw would tighten for just a second when she moved easily across the yard and he had to plan a route he once would have walked without thought. He never asked for help unless he had to. When he did ask, he asked plainly, without performance, and she helped the same way. No ceremony, no excess. She respected that. He had built himself a low platform on wheels, rough, makeshift, just 2 boards, and a set of old casters from a broken cabinet that let him move around the cabin floor when the chair was too cumbersome. She found him one morning on the floor of the small side room, surrounded by pieces of metal, working with a hand drill and a cold chisel. She looked at the parts and then at his face. "What is this going to be?" she asked. "An overhead pulley system." He held up a length of chain. "If I anchor 3 fixed points here, here, and at the door, I can pull myself between stations without needing the chair or the platform. Faster, quieter, less in your way." She looked at the anchor points he'd marked on the ceiling beams with chalk. Precise spacing. He'd measured it to account for his own reach and arm strength. "You're not in my way," she said. He looked at her briefly, then back at the chain. "I will be eventually. Better to build around it now." She sat on the floor next to him, not to help. She wasn't asked, but because she was tired from the morning, and the floor was as good a place as any, and sitting with him while he worked felt natural in a way she couldn't explain. She watched his hands. They were sure hands. Whatever the bear had taken from him below the waist, it hadn't touched his hands. "What were you building before?" she asked. "Before the injury, mining infrastructure. Shaft ventilation systems, mostly. Load-bearing support frameworks for deep van extraction." He turned a bolt between his fingers. "I had a patent pending on a lateral brace design that would have cut cave-in rates by about 40%. Never got to file it. Why not? Montana happened." He said it without drama, just the plain fact of it. She was quiet for a moment. "File it now," she said. He looked at her. "From here? You've got hands, you've got paper. What else do you need?" He didn't answer right away, but she saw something shift behind his eyes. Some small door, opening. He was nearly finished with the pulley system when it happened. He had mounted 2 of the 3 anchor points and was reaching across to test the tension on the chain when the platform beneath him shifted on an uneven floorboard and went sideways. He went with it. There was no stopping it, just the quick, graceless physics of weight and imbalance. And then he was on the floor. He wasn't hurt. He lay still for a moment, facing up and in the breath. Before he could start the careful process of getting himself back up, Eva was there. She had heard it from the kitchen. She came in fast, dropped down beside him, and before either of them had spoken a word, she had slid her arm beneath his shoulders to brace him. She was stronger than she looked years. of farm work had made her genuinely strong, and she got his upper body lifted before he could redirect her. The space was small. In the effort of bracing him, she had ended up closer than either of them planned, her body pressed against his side as she took his weight, her face near his. She could feel the heat of him. She could see the precise dark color of his eyes at this distance. He went very still, not from pain, from something more careful than that. She got him lifted and eased him back into the chair, and then she didn't move away immediately, because moving away immediately felt like it would mean something, and she didn't want to assign meaning to it. So she stayed where she was for a moment, hands still on his arm, catching her breath. "I'm all right," he said. Quietly. "I know," she said. "I wasn't worried about that." He looked at her this close. His gaze was different from other men's. It didn't take inventory. It didn't move over her, the way she'd grown used to men's eyes moving, calculating, wanting. He just looked at her the way you look at someone you are trying to understand. She felt her breath change. "You don't look at me the way other men do," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. He didn't look away. "I see you," he said simply. "Not an object. You." She was quiet for a long moment. The cabin was very still around them. Outside, a late summer wind moved through the grass with a sound like rushing water. "Gerald never touched me," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. "He died an hour after the ceremony." Before, she stopped. "I have never belonged to any man, not once." She watched his face carefully as she said it. The way you watch a person's face when you've handed them something fragile, and you want to know if they understand what it is. Lorcan's expression didn't change into something hungry. It didn't calculate. If anything, it went gentler. "Then you've been yourself this whole time," he said. She blinked. "That's an unusual way to hear that." "It's the true way," he said. She stood up slowly and straightened her dress and looked out the window because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't his face. "I'll get supper started," she said. "Eva." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, for just helping. "The way you did." She nodded once and went to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a long time doing nothing, thinking about the word reverence and whether she had ever been on the receiving end of it before tonight. She didn't think she had. The mudslide came in late October after 3 days of cold rain. It wasn't catastrophic. A section of the back ridge let go in the night, maybe 20 feet of hillside, maybe less, and came down slow enough that it piled up against the fence line rather than breaking through it. Eva found it in the morning. A dark tongue of wet earth spreading out from the base of the ridge, carrying rocks and roots and broken clay. She stood at the edge of it, with her boots already muddy, and looked at the fence posts that would need to be reset, and thought about how many hours that was going to cost her. Lorcan had come up behind her on the wheeled platform, moving across the rough ground with the focused effort of someone who has learned to read terrain from below. He stopped at her side and looked at the slide. Then he looked closer. He leaned forward. His eyes moved across the exposed face of the hillside with a different kind of attention, not assessing damage, but reading the earth itself, the way he had been trained to do across 10 years of mining work. The exposed soil was dark, not the brown dark of ordinary clay, a deeper black, layered in a band about 3 feet wide running horizontal across the cut face of the ridge. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Hand me that stick." Eva handed him a branch from the debris. He used it to scrape carefully at the exposed face, pulling away loose surface mud to see what was underneath. The black band widened. He scraped further. It didn't thin out. If anything, it deepened. He brought a piece of it close to his face and broke it between his fingers, examining the fracture. He pressed it between his thumb and forefinger and felt the weight of it. He looked at the ridge line above, measuring something in his head. "Go get me a jar of water," he said. She didn't ask questions. She went. When she came back, he dropped a fragment of the black soil into the water and watched how it settled. He was very still while he watched, the kind of still that means a person's mind is moving fast. "Lorcan." She kept her voice even. "What is it?" He looked up at her. "Iron ore," he said. "High grade. Mixed with bituminous coal seaming, which is rarer than it sounds." He looked back at the ridge. That vein doesn't start here. This is just where it breaks the surface. If this ridge runs the direction I think it does, that seam extends across most of your back 40. Eva looked at the muddy hillside, then at him. How valuable, she said. At current industrial rates. He did the arithmetic in his head without appearing to try. Developed, properly, with the right extraction equipment and a Chicago rail connection, we're talking about enough ore to run a foundry for 20 years. Maybe more. She stood there a moment, taking that in. This is why Vance wants the land, she said. It wasn't a question. He may not know the specifics yet, but he knows something's here. Men like Vance always know when something's valuable, even before they know what it is. Lorcan looked at her steadily. This changes things, Eva. This changes everything. The air between them was very still. What do we do? She said. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. She could see it. First, we tell no one. Not a word. Not in town, not in a letter, not in passing. He looked at the exposed vein again, then at the fence line. We need to recover this before anyone rides past and sees it. Pack the mud back against the face, reset the fence, act like it was ordinary damage. And then I write a letter to Chicago. He had contacts there, engineers he'd worked with in his previous life. Before Montana, before the bear took his legs and the mining company took his patents. Men who respected geological work and didn't ask too many questions about the man holding the survey equipment. He spent the next 4 days in the cabin while Eva handled the fence and the replanted mud on her own. She didn't complain about that. She understood what he was doing was more important than the fence. She had always understood that a person's value lies in what their mind can do, not just their hands. Lorcan filled 12 pages of precise technical notation, cross-section diagrams of the ridge, soil composition analysis drawn from the fragments he'd collected, projection maps of likely vein extension based on the geological formation of the surrounding land, load estimates, rail access calculations, timeline projections for extraction and refinery output. He wrote it the way he wrote everything: clean, exact, without waste. At the bottom of the letter, he wrote a partnership proposal. He was not offering his labor. He was offering his intellectual property, the survey rights, the engineering oversight, and a patent-pending extraction system he had been quietly developing in the margins of his notebooks for the past 3 years. He was offering his mind, and his mind was worth considerably more than he had been led to believe. Eva read it over his shoulder the night before he sealed it. She read slowly. She was not a mining engineer, but she was not a fool either, and she understood contracts and she understood leverage. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're not asking them for charity," she said. "No, you're giving them the opportunity to make money alongside a man who knows what he's doing." "Exactly." She nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "That's the right way to ask." The mail rider came through Oakhaven every Tuesday. Lorcan had the letter sealed and addressed to a firm on LaSalle Street in Chicago by Sunday evening. He held it in his hands a moment before he gave it to her to take to town. "If this works," he said, "Vance won't be able to touch this land. Not legally, not financially, not anyway. And if it doesn't work," she said. He looked at her with those level, dark eyes. "Then we think of something else," he said. "But it will work." She took the letter to town on Monday morning, mailed it without speaking to anyone, and came back before noon. The ridge sat behind the homestead. All through October and into November, its secret pressed flat under mud and reset fence posts, patient as the earth itself. Lorcan kept his notebook close. He kept working on the patents. He added pages to the technical file every night by lamplight while Eva read across the table. And the cabin was quiet, and the iron ore waited in the dark ground for someone smart enough to claim it properly. That person was already sitting at the table. He just needed the rest of the world to catch up. November came in hard. The frost arrived 2 weeks early, which meant the ground set before Eva had finished putting the root cellar in order. And the firewood pile was not yet as tall as she needed it to be. She worked through the cold without complaint, splitting logs in the gray morning light while her breath made small clouds in the air, and the axe head rang against the wood with a sound like a bell. Lorcan watched from the porch sometimes, not passively. He was always doing something with his hands, sharpening tools, mending harness leather, working on the notebook, but he watched. He had a way of being present that didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like company. They had settled into something by now. Not a formal arrangement, something more honest than that. They ate together and worked in proximity and talked in the evenings by the fire about things that mattered: the land, the letter to Chicago, what winter was going to require of them. There were silences that neither of them felt the need to fill. Eva had not known many silences she was comfortable in. This one she was. Lorcan had finished the overhead pulley system. 3 anchor points, chain-linked, running from the bedroom door to the kitchen to the front window. He could cross the cabin without the chair now, hand over hand, smooth and fast. Eva had come home one afternoon to find him at the kitchen shelf, reaching for a tin of coffee, with the ease of someone who had decided that gravity was a negotiation, not a sentence. She hadn't said anything. She'd just put her coat on the peg and gone to start supper. But she had smiled, facing the wall. They came on a Thursday night, when the cold had settled in so completely that the world outside the windows looked like a charcoal drawing, all gray and black, and no color anywhere. Eva heard the horses first. 2 of them, moving without haste, which was worse somehow than if they'd come fast. Men in a hurry are often scared. Men who take their time have already decided what they're going to do. She went to the window. In the darkness, she could make out the shapes of riders stopping at the gate. Then Declan Brooks's voice carried across the yard, unhurried, almost conversational. "Mrs. Sterling, open up. County business." There was a deputy with him. Eva recognized the silhouette, a man named Hurley, who had worked for Vance's interests since before anyone could remember, and had a badge that functioned more as decoration than law. Lorcan had already come up behind her, quiet on the platform, moving without the chair. He looked out the window beside her. "Don't open the door," he said, low. "I wasn't going to," she said, equally low. Declan didn't wait long. He pushed the gate open and walked his horse into the yard like it was already his. Hurley followed. They dismounted at the porch steps, and Declan came up them without knocking. Because men like Declan don't knock, they announce, and they expect the door to open on the announcement. It didn't open. He tried the handle. It held. Eva had thrown the bar. A silence. Then Declan went around to the side of the cabin, where the food store was kept, a lean-to structure built against the outer wall, shelved with jarred goods and smoked meat and the dried vegetables that were going to carry Eva through winter. Eva heard the door of it splinter. She heard jars break. She heard the deliberate, unhurried sound of a man destroying something slowly. "So you understand, he is not in a rush." She pressed her back against the inner wall. Her jaw was set. Lorcan had already moved. He went to the corner of the room where he kept the Sharps rifle, a .5 caliber buffalo gun, heavy and long, the barrel worn to a dark shine from years of use. He'd cleaned it 3 days ago. Eva had watched him do it, had noted the efficiency of it, the lack of any kind of ceremony. He cleaned it the way a carpenter maintains a good plane. It was a tool. He intended to use it as one. He positioned himself in the shadows beside the doorway, the rifle resting across the lower crossbar of the pulley frame for support. The food store went quiet. Then Declan came back around to the front. He stood in the yard below the porch steps, and he had a torch in his hand now, and Hurley was behind him with his thumbs in his belt, and a look on his face that said he'd watched this kind of thing before. The door opened. Eva stood in the frame, not cowering, upright, arms at her sides, chin level. The cold poured in around her. "You broke my food store," she said. "Accident," Declan said. "These old structures aren't built to last." He smiled. "Senator Vance wants to have a conversation about your property, Mrs. Sterling. He's asked me to extend the invitation personally." "I've had Senator Vance's invitations before," she said. "My answer hasn't changed." Declan came up the porch steps, 1, then 2 slowly, torch in hand. "Maybe," he said. "You need a new perspective on the situation." He reached for her. The Sharps fired from inside the cabin. The sound was enormous in the night air, a deep, cracking boom that rolled out across the frost-hard fields and sent the horses shying at their posts. Declan reeled back with a noise that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a curse, and pressed his right hand against his chest. His trigger finger was gone at the second joint. He stared at his own hand with the particular disbelief of a man discovering that consequences are real after all. Hurley had his pistol halfway out when Lorcan's voice came from the darkness inside the doorway. "Touch it, and you'll need a new hand to match his." Lorcan's voice in that moment was something Eva had not heard from him before. Not loud, not angry, completely level, and made entirely of certainty. "Touch her again," Lorcan said, "and the next bullet goes right between your eyes." Hurley put his pistol back. Declan was breathing through his teeth, blood running down his wrist, still staring at his hand, as though he couldn't make sense of the arithmetic. "Get off my property," Eva said. "Both of you. Take your horses and your badge, and whatever Vance is paying you for this, and go." They went. She watched them ride out of the gate and down the dark road until the sound of hooves faded into the cold night. Then she turned and went inside and closed the door and set the bar back in place. Lorcan had lowered the sharps. He was watching her. "You're not shaking," he said. "I'm saving that for later," she said. She sat down at the table. He came and positioned himself across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He would if she started. "I know if you hadn't, Lorne, been here, but I was." He leaned forward slightly. "Eva, look at me." She looked. "What happened tonight," he said, "was not something that happened to you because of who you are, or what you look like, or because you're alone out here. It happened because a corrupt man sent corrupt men to take something that isn't theirs. That is about his character, not yours." She was quiet for a moment. "I know that," she said. "Good." He held her gaze. "Every person, no matter how the world has positioned them, no matter what they've been called or how they've been treated, has an absolute right to defend their body and their dignity. You didn't need me to do that tonight. I just happened to be in a better position to make the point." She thought about that. "He won't come back as easily now," she said. "No," Lorcan agreed, "but he will come back. Men like Declan are instruments. The question is the man holding the instrument." He looked at the window. "And Vance is going to be very interested in what happened tonight." She was already thinking about the letter in Chicago. The timeline. How long before they heard back? "Teach me to use the rifle," she said. Lorcan looked at her. "You sure?" "You just told me I have the right to defend myself," she said. "I'd like to do it at range." Something crossed his face that was the closest she'd seen to a full smile. "All right," he said. "We start tomorrow." December arrived and immediately made itself unpleasant. The first real snow came on a Sunday, which felt almost biblical in its timing, and by Tuesday it had become something else entirely, a blizzard that rolled in from the northwest with a sound like a train and didn't let up. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that has intention behind it, the kind that wants something from you. Eva and Lorcan had prepared as well as they could, given the wrecked food store. She had ridden into Oakhaven twice in November, paying coin for dried goods, keeping her eyes down, and her business brief. People watched her leave the general store with the particular attention of a town that disapproves of someone succeeding at something. She had not given them the satisfaction of looking back. The cabin held the heat reasonably well. Lorcan had spent most of November working on the insulation, stuffing dried grass and old burlap between the outer logs and the interior boards, rechinking gaps with a clay and straw mixture he'd developed from memory. He worked steadily, systematically, moving along the walls on his platform like a man painting a fence. By early December, the cabin held warmth almost twice as long on a single fire load. Eva noticed. She told him so. He said he'd been doing the calculation in his head since September and had been waiting for the right materials. She said that was a long time to carry arithmetic around. He said he carried longer ones than that. On the third night of the blizzard, the roof began to speak. Not dramatically, just a low, sustained creak, like a wooden ship in a slow swell. Eva had been asleep and it woke her, because she was the kind of sleeper who had learned over years of solitude to treat unusual sounds as information. She went to the main room. Lorcan was already there. "How long has it been doing that?" she asked. "About an hour." He was looking at the ceiling with a lamp raised. The snow load is too much for the center beam. You see that? He pointed. A crack had worked its way through the plaster near the ridge joint. What do? We brace it. Now, before it goes further, they worked through the dark hours of early morning. Eva climbed where Lorcan directed, setting timber props from floor to beam, at the angles he specified, cutting wedges to tighten the fit, driving them in with a mallet while the storm screamed outside. Lorcan managed the geometry from below, calling adjustments, calculating load paths in his head. It was exhausting work and cold work, and they did it without complaint, speaking only what was necessary. Once, the beam gave a sharp crack that stopped them both in a single held breath. Then it settled. They kept going. By 3 in the morning, the props were in place, and the cracking had stopped. Eva came down from the ladder and sat on the floor right where she was, back against the wall, too tired to walk to a chair. Lorcan positioned himself beside her on the floor. They sat in the lamplight with the blizzard outside, and neither of them spoke for a while. "The roof will hold now," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should sleep." "Yes," she said. But neither of them moved immediately. She was aware of how close he was. She was aware of his shoulder near hers, and his breathing, and the solidity of him. She was aware that she was not afraid of this awareness, which was new information about herself. She stood up before it could become anything she wasn't ready for. He did not remark on it. She went to bed. The barn went up 2 hours before dawn. She smelled the smoke first, even through the sealed cabin. By the time she got to the window, the barn wall was already orange, and the snow was lit from below, eerie and bright, and she could hear the sound of fire doing. What fire does, not the crackling you hear in a hearth, but the deep, consuming roar of something structural burning. She went for the door. "Eva, the animals," she said. She had 2 horses and 4 laying hens. She got them out. It cost her the wool blanket off her own shoulders, thrown over the nearest mare's eyes so she'd move without panicking, and it cost her burned palms on the barn door handle and a lungful of smoke that had her coughing in the snow. But she got them out, and she drove them toward the fence line to get them clear of the heat. She didn't see the men until she was turning back. There were 3 of them, mounted, sitting their horses at the far edge of the firelight where the darkness started. 2 of them she didn't recognize. The third was Declan Brooks, his right hand wrapped in a heavy black bandage, riding a gray horse and watching the barn burn with the focused pleasure of someone who has been waiting to feel this. She ran back for the cabin. Lorcan was already out. He had hauled himself out the front door and was moving through the snow on his hands, dragging himself with his arms, because the wheeled platform was useless in snow, and he had not hesitated. He was moving toward her. "Get inside," he said when he reached her. "Declan's. I know. I see them. Get inside." She went ahead of him and held the door, and he pulled himself up and over the threshold, and she got the door shut and the bar down just as the first shot hit the wall outside. Not a rifle, a pistol, fired high, meant to communicate rather than kill. For now, Lorcan pulled himself to the window. He looked at the riders. He looked at Declan. A second shot. The window glass didn't break. They were shooting wide, but the message was clear. "Come out, the sharps," Ava said. "Not enough angle from here." And they're expecting, he was thinking. The root cellar. If we go through the back, the third shot was not wide. It came through the front door. It found Lorcan. He was at the window, turned slightly, and the bullet caught him in the chest, high and left, and the impact drove him backward off the platform and down. Eva dropped to the floor before she knew she was moving. She got to him. His eyes were open. He was breathing short, harsh, surprised breaths, and his hand came up and pressed against his chest with the automatic response of a body reporting damage. Blood on her hands, red on the floor. "Lorcan," she pressed both hands over his. "Stay with me. Stay right here." He looked at her. His face was gray in the firelight coming through the window, and his breathing was wrong, but his eyes were clear and focused on her face. Outside, Declan's voice carried across the burning yard. "Come on out, Mrs. Sterling. Bring the deed." She did not come out. She stayed on the floor with her hands on Lorcan's chest, and the barn burning outside and the fire throwing orange light across the walls, and she pressed down and she talked to him, not comforting nonsense, real things. True things about Chicago and the letter and the spring and what they were going to build. And she did not stop pressing, and she did not let go. She heard one of the riders approach the cabin door. She heard something else, too, from Lorcan, barely audible through the blood and the smoke and the roaring of the fire. "Inside pocket," he said. "Coat." She reached into the inside pocket of his heavy leather coat, and her fingers found something hard. A steel plate, not a rivet, not a buckle, a full flat plate of iron, maybe 3 inches by 4, that he had sewn into the coat lining. She had noticed the coat was heavy. She had never asked why. The bullet had hit it, not centered the angle, had driven part of the lead through, but the plate had caught most of it, had broken the force, had kept it from going where it would have gone otherwise. She looked at his face. "You built armor into your coat," she said. He moved his jaw. A sound came out that may have been an attempt at a word, or may have been an attempt at a laugh. She couldn't tell. The door opened. Declan stepped inside. He looked at Lorcan on the floor. He looked at Eva crouched over him, blood on her hands, and the deed visible in her coat pocket, where she'd kept it since the last time he'd come. He crossed the room. He reached into her pocket and took the deed. She looked up at him. She did not beg. She did not speak. He looked down at Lorcan's motionless form, and then at Eva holding him, and then he turned and walked out the door into the snow and the burning dark, and he didn't look back. The fire behind them threw shadows across the cabin walls. The snow outside reflected orange and red, and Oak Haven slept through all of it, and nobody came. Eva screamed once, not from fear, from a fury so large it needed somewhere to go. And then she stopped, and she pressed her hands back against Lorcan's wound, and she began to figure out what she was going to do next. Because that was what you did. You stayed with the person who mattered, and you figured out what came next. And you did not let the dark win. Not tonight. The root cellar saved them. Eva had built it 3 summers ago with her own hands, dug it out of the hillside behind the cabin, shored up the walls with flat stones, laid a plank door flat against the earth, and covered it with sod. It wasn't large, 6 feet by 8, low enough that you had to bend to move around inside it. But it held heat the way the earth holds heat, steady and patient. And when she got Lorcan, through the back window, and across the frozen ground, and down through that door, the cold stopped trying to kill them immediately. She worked by feel in the dark. She had grabbed the lamp, but lost it in the snow. She had the wool blanket from the mare, retrieved from the fence line, and she packed it around Lorcan and pressed her back against the dirt wall beside him, and listened to his breathing. It was rough, but it was there. The wound was bad enough. The steel plate had done what Lorcan had intended, broken the bullet's force, redirected it, but the lead had still cut through at the edge and opened a gash along his left side, below the shoulder, deep enough to bleed seriously. Not deep enough, she was now certain, to have touched anything vital. She cleaned it in the dark, working by touch, using strips from the hem of her own dress, soaked in the last of the whiskey she'd taken from the kitchen shelf on the way out. Lorcan made no sound during this. He lay still and let her work, which told her he trusted her, and also that he was conserving what strength he had. "The bullet went through the edge of the plate," she said, working. "It's a cut, not a lodged round. I can see the whole wound." "How deep?" he said. His voice was steady but thin. "Deep enough that we're having this conversation in a hole in the ground," she said. "Not deep enough that we won't be having conversations above ground again." A pause. "Good math," he said. She almost laughed. She packed the wound tight and bound it with the remaining strips, and then sat back and let her hands rest, and took the first full breath she'd taken since the shot. Outside, above them, the blizzard continued. She could hear it faintly through the earth. She could not hear the fire anymore, which meant either the barn had finished burning or the snow had taken it. Either way, it was done. The deed was gone. Declan had it. She sat with that fact and looked at it plainly. A deed was paper. Paper could be contested in court if you had the right evidence, the right standing, the right resources. She did not have those things yet. But the letter was in Chicago, and the letter was real, And what Lorcan had built in those 12 pages of technical notation was more durable than a sheet of paper with a county seal on it. She had to believe that. She did believe it. She heard them before she saw them. On the second morning in the cellar, while Lorcan slept, and the blizzard had finally dropped to a gray, exhausted quiet outside, she heard voices. High voices. Children. She lifted the cellar door an inch and looked out. Two children stood at the ruin of the cabin's back wall, which the fire from the barn had partially caught in the night. One whole corner was charred black, though the structure had held. The children were thin in a way that had nothing to do with one bad winter. A boy, maybe 10, dark-eyed and watchful. A girl, slightly younger, with her coat too large, clearly not originally hers, pulled around her shoulders and her arms wrapped tight around herself. They were not from Oakhaven. Eva had never seen them. She pushed the cellar door fully open and climbed out. They startled, the boy, stepping in front of the girl immediately, chin up, trying to look larger than he was. "We didn't take nothing," he said. Fast, the reflex of a child who has learned to lead with that sentence. "I know," Eva said. She looked at them carefully, their hollow cheeks, their cracked lips, the way the girl was shaking, not just from cold, but from something more sustained than one night in the weather. "How long have you been outside?" The boy said nothing. The girl looked at him. "Bo," she said softly. He let out a breath. "2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. Where did you come from?" "Oakhaven." He said it flatly, without nostalgia. She didn't ask more than that. Not right then. She had enough experience with the faces of people who have been failed by the places they came from. You don't make them explain it while they're still standing in the cold. "Come down," she said, and held the cellar door open. Bo looked at the opening, then at her, measuring. "There's a man down there," she said. "He's hurt, and he's sleeping. He's not a threat to you. I give you my word." The girl Naomi went first. Bo followed. Lorcan was awake by the time they got settled. He looked at the 2 children in the lamplight. She'd found the spare lamp and its oil, and he looked at Eva, and he asked no questions. He moved himself back to make room, and he said to Bo directly, "There's dried beef in the left tin on the second shelf. Help yourself." Bo looked at him for a long moment. Then he got the tin. Lorcan's recovery took 11 days in total. The first 4 in the cellar, and the rest in the partially rebuilt cabin, where Ava and Bo together managed to patch the burned corner with salvaged boards and tack canvas over the gap until proper lumber could be found. Naomi turned out to be extraordinarily useful in a kitchen, which surprised everyone, including Naomi. She had a memory for proportions and an instinct for heat that Eva recognized as genuine talent. And within 2 days she had taken over the morning cornmeal without being asked. Bo did not offer information about himself or Naomi easily. He gave it out in small pieces. Over time, the way you give out rations when you're not certain how long you have to make them last. Eva learned not to press. She learned to be present and consistent, and to let him decide when to speak. Lorcan understood this without being told. He talked to Bo the way he talked about everything plainly, about real things, about how materials worked, and why structures held, and what the difference was between good iron and bad iron. Bo listened with a focus that suggested he was quietly filing everything away. On the 8th day, the mail rider came. Eva met him at the gate. He had 2 letters, one for her, one addressed to Lorcan Prescott in care of her address, which meant someone in Chicago knew where to find him. She brought them both inside and set them on the table. Lorcan looked at the Chicago letter for a moment. Then he opened it. He read it slowly, and Eva watched his face, and his face gave her nothing for 30 seconds. And then he set it down and looked up. "They accepted the patents," he said. She said nothing. She waited. "They're dispatching an engineering crew in the spring. Initial capital has already been wire transferred to the Oakhaven Bank in both our names." He looked at the letter again, then at her. "They didn't fund us because they felt sorry for anyone. They funded us because the survey work was airtight and the extraction projections are sound." He paused. "They said, and I'm reading. Directly, we have not seen geological assessment of this quality in 3 years of applications." Eva sat down, not from weakness, from the need to be still for a moment while something large settled into place. "We need a lawyer," she said. "Yes, in the county seat, not Oakhaven. And we need to contest the deed. That too. But with the bank transfer on record and the engineering crew coming, any judge with functioning eyes will understand who actually has standing on that land." He looked at her. Declan took a piece of paper. He left behind the ore and the patents and the capital. He made a bad trade. From the corner of the room, Beau had been listening with the careful stillness of a child who has learned that adult conversations contain important information. He looked at Lorcan. "So you're not beat?" he said. Lorcan looked at him. "No," he said. "We're not beat. We were never going to be beat. We just needed time for the work to catch up with the situation." Beau nodded slowly, absorbing this. Naomi looked up from the cornmeal pot and said nothing, but she was smiling. Spring came like a man who has been away a long time, gradually, then all at once. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind mud and the pale yellow of old grass, and then green started happening at the edges of things, tentative at first, and then with conviction. The creek that ran along the back of Eva's property ran high and fast with snowmelt. The air lost its edge. Lorcan built his chair in March. It took him 3 weeks of evenings, working after supper by lamplight, with Beau handing him tools and asking questions that Lorcan answered as he went. It was constructed from the salvaged gears of an old grain harvester that had sat rusted in the far corner of the property. Since before Eva had bought the land, large chain-drive sprockets, iron wheel hubs, a hand-crank mechanism on the right side that engaged a chain loop running to the rear axle. The wheels were broad with flat iron treads, designed for rough ground. When it was finished, Lorcan assembled himself into it in the early morning, before anyone else was awake. Eva came out to find him crossing the yard in it, not slowly, not carefully, but moving with the particular confidence of a man operating a machine he designed himself. The chair handled the ruts and the uneven ground without complaint. On the packed dirt of the main path, it was genuinely fast. He came to a stop in front of her. She looked at the chair, at the craftsmanship of it, the clean weld points, the measured proportions, the hand crank sitting at exactly the right height for his arm length. "You built that to your own specifications," she said. "Nobody else's would fit," he said. She put her hand on the side rail for a moment, not to steady him. He didn't need steadying, but in the way you touch something that someone made, to acknowledge the making of it. "It's good work, Lorcan. It gets better from here," he said. The engineering crew from Chicago arrived in April. 4 men, led by a survey chief named Alderman, who wore spectacles and spoke in the compressed sentences of someone who bills by the hour. They shook Lorcan's hand without any ceremony about the chair, which told Eva they had been briefed, or were simply professional enough not to make it a subject. Either way, she noted it. Construction on the expanded homestead began immediately. Lorcan supervised from the chair, moving along the perimeter of the work, making decisions and corrections, and occasionally taking a tool from a worker's hand to demonstrate something faster. Alderman learned within the first 2 days to bring his questions directly to Lorcan and to listen to the answers carefully. The homestead grew. A new main cabin, twice the size of the old one. A machine shop with a forge, a proper root cellar with ventilation. A small schoolroom, built last, separate from the main structure, with a south-facing window for light, and 2 rows of benches that Beau helped plane and sand until the wood was smooth enough not to snag a sleeve. Eva taught the school. It was not a formal thing, not at first. It began the way most real things begin, with necessity. Beau could not read. Naomi could not either, but she had a quicker ear for the logic of letters and was decoding simple words within the first week. They worked mornings, after chores. The 4 of them gathered in the little south-lit room, Eva at the front, Lorcan sometimes present, sometimes working outside within earshot. One morning in late April, Eva was teaching Naomi to write. Naomi was frustrated. She had the slate in her lap and the chalk in her hand, and she had written her own name twice, and each time it came out slightly wrong, and she erased it with the heel of her hand with a sharp, unhappy sound. Eva waited until the frustration had passed its peak. Then she went to the large chalkboard at the front of the room and wrote one word in large, clear letters. Human. She set the chalk down and turned to face Naomi. Read that, she said. Naomi looked at the board, sounded it out carefully. Human, she said. That is the only category that matters, Eva said. Not where you came from, not who your parents were, not what you own or don't own, or what this town or any other town has decided to call you. She looked at Naomi directly, and her voice was quiet, but it carried the full weight of something she had earned the right to say. The only difference between you and Senator Vance is that he had money to buy ink before you did. Now you have a board. Write your name right next to his. Naomi looked at the board. She stood up, and she went to the front, and she wrote her name in large, careful letters right next to that word. Naomi. She stood back and looked at it. Bo was very still on his bench. Lorcan, in the doorway where he'd been listening, said nothing. He looked at the board, and then at Eva, and Eva looked back at him, and between them passed something that didn't need language. Outside, the spring was well underway, and the survey crew was driving stakes along the back ridge, and the iron ore sat in the earth waiting to be claimed properly, and in the little schoolroom with the south-facing window, Naomi's name stood on the board next to the most fundamental fact about her. She had always been human. She just had a board now to write it on. Oakhaven's collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a bad tooth goes slowly. Then, suddenly, and with a lot of pain at the end, Vance's mind had been running on borrowed confidence since the fall. He'd brought in cheap labor, cut corners on the shaft supports, and dismissed the engineering concerns of every man who raised them. The cave-in happened on a Wednesday morning in February, 3 weeks after the ground had softened enough to make the whole operation unstable. Nobody died, which was luck, not planning. But the operation shut down completely, and with it went the revenue stream that had been keeping Vance's various interests alive. Lorcan had been watching the banknotes for 6 months. He didn't announce this. He didn't explain it to anyone in town. He simply wrote letters to Chicago, to the county lending office, to 2 private creditors in St. Louis who held Vance's paper, and he waited for the right arithmetic to present itself. When it did, he moved. The capital from Chicago had been sitting in the Oakhaven Bank in both his and Eva's names since January. It was more money than most people in that county had seen assembled in one place. He used it methodically, buying up Vance's outstanding debt instruments one at a time, through a law firm in the county seat that did not advertise whose interests it was serving. By the time the snow melted off the ridge line in March, Lorcan Prescott held the note on Vance's mine, the note on his ranch house, and a controlling share of the debt attached to the Oakhaven General Goods Warehouse, he told Eva over supper. She listened without interrupting. She had learned that Lorcan's explanations had architecture. They went somewhere, and interrupting them was like pulling a support beam before the structure was finished. When he was done, she set her fork down. You own his debt, she said. We own his debt, he said. She thought about that. And if he can't pay, he can't pay. That's already established. The question is what comes next. What came next was Eva's idea. She had been planning it since November, quietly, in the same way she planned everything, by watching what was actually needed, and then filling the gap without ceremony. Oakhaven's general store charged prices that bore no relationship to what goods actually cost. The markup was old and unquestioned, and people paid it because they had nowhere else to go. Eva opened a direct market on the South Road, a quarter-mile outside town, selling from the homestead's own production, plus a supply agreement she'd negotiated with 2 farms south of the county line. The prices were honest. People came, not right away. The first week, it was mostly the families who had nothing to lose by being seen there but food, is a powerful argument, and by the 3rd week, the line stretched back past the fence post. The town merchants who had watched Eva hauling water in silence and whispered about the widow on the ridge now watched their own customers walk past their storefronts on the way to hers. Declan Brooks rode past the market one afternoon and stared at the line of people. He didn't stop. He rode on, but his jaw was tight, and his good hand was closed on the reins. And Eva saw him from behind the market table, and did not look away until he was gone. Bo worked the market on Saturdays. He had turned out to be a natural at it, direct, fair, quick at counting back change, and possessed of an authority in his voice that was remarkable for a child his age. He didn't ask for permission to run things the way he thought they should run. He simply ran them that way and waited to be corrected. He rarely was. Naomi helped in the kitchen where the baked goods were made, and her cornbread sold out before noon every week without exception. Lorcan didn't come to the market often. He was occupied with the engineering crew, with the ongoing extraction work on the ridge, and with the legal correspondence that had been building since January. But Eva told him about Bo one evening, about the way the boy stood behind that table, and Lorcan was quiet for a moment. He knows what it is to have nothing, Lorcan said. That's not a disadvantage. That's the clearest possible understanding of value. Eva nodded. He's going to be formidable, she said. He already is, Lorcan said. Outside, the spring evening settled over the homestead, the new cabin, the machine shop, the proper root cellar, the schoolroom with its south-facing window, and the ridge behind it all held its iron ore patiently while the work continued. And the lights burned late in the house, where the people who had been written off kept proving, quietly and without drama, that the people who write others off are almost always wrong. The morning Vance came to town for the last time, he came with 6 armed men. It was April, clear and cold in the early hours, and Eva had been up since before sunrise the way she always was. She heard the riders from the window and recognized the formation, the particular arrangement of bodies on horseback that communicates intent, not a visit, a declaration. She went and got Lorcan. He was already dressed. He had heard them, too. They rode into Oakhaven in the chair and on horseback, respectively, Eva on the gray mare and Lorcan moving alongside on the iron-wheeled chair at a pace that kept up without effort. The chain drive had been refined 3 times since March. On packed road, it was genuinely fast. The law firm from the county seat had sent 2 men who were already waiting in front of the town hall when Eva and Lorcan arrived. A judge had signed the documentation 2 days prior. Everything was in order. Everything had been in order for weeks. Lorcan had simply been waiting for Vance to make a move that justified the timing of what came next. Vance stood on the steps of the town hall, with his 6 hired men fanned behind him, and a land deed in his hand, Eva's original deed, stolen from her coat on the night of the fire, and he held it up like a man holding a winning card. Lorcan stopped the chair at the base of the steps. He looked up at Vance. He did not raise his voice. "That deed is void," he said. "It was obtained through theft in the commission of arson, which the county sheriff's office has been made aware of with full documentation. Declan Brooks's name appears on 3 sworn statements already entered into the county record." He paused. "You may want to look behind you." Vance turned. The county sheriff had ridden in from the east road, while Vance's attention had been on the front of the building. He had 2 deputies. He had a warrant. Declan was on horseback behind Vance, and when he saw the sheriff, something happened in his face, some last calculation that came out wrong, and then his shoulders dropped, and the fight went out of him. He had known, probably for months, that there was a version of this morning where it ended exactly this way. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. The arrest was quiet and procedural. Declan came down off the horse without resistance. He looked at Lorcan as they put the cuffs on him, and Lorcan looked back, and nothing passed between them that needed to be said. The sheriff's men let Vance's hired hands go. They weren't worth the paperwork. They scattered like men who have suddenly remembered they have other places to be. Vance stood on the town hall steps alone. He looked older than he had in the fall. The winter had taken something from him that went deeper than money. He looked at Lorcan in the chair and at Eva beside him, and whatever he had thought he was looking at when he'd first set eyes on them, a broken man and a defenseless woman, a problem that could be resolved with enough pressure, he was clearly seeing something different now, and the recalculation was not going well for him. Lorcan handed a document up to the law firm's representative, who walked it to the town hall clerk standing in the doorway. "The mine," Lorcan said, now operates under a single consolidated holding in both our names. The warehouse debt transfers on execution of the deed of default, which occurred this morning when the quarterly payment failed to arrive. The ranch is subject to foreclosure proceedings that are already filed. He looked at Vance steadily. You are welcome to contest any of this in court. I've found courts to be very interested in arson documentation and sworn testimony about assault. Vance said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, I underestimated you. Yes, Lorcan said. Most people do. He turned the chair and started back up the road. Eva rode alongside him, and the April light fell over both of them, and the street of Oakhaven was very quiet as they passed. The merchants stood in their doorways and watched them go. The same people who had called Eva a jinx. The same people who had accepted everything. Vance told them about her without examining a single word of it. They stood there with their arms at their sides, and they watched her pass, and she looked straight ahead and did not hurry and did not slow. Bo and Naomi were waiting at the gate when they got home. Naomi looked at Eva's face and seemed to read it accurately. Did it work? She asked. It worked, Eva said. Naomi smiled and went back inside to start the midday meal. Bo sat on the fence post and watched Lorcan come through the gate, and his dark eyes moved over the man in the iron chair with an expression that was old for his age. I want to learn the law, Bo said, after the reading. I want to learn how it works. Lorcan stopped the chair. That is an excellent idea, he said. We'll start with property rights. They're the most useful. Why those first? Lorcan said. Property rights are where most injustice happens, and the people who understand them are the people who don't get taken. Bo nodded. He got down from the fence post and went inside. 1 year to the day after, Declan Brooks shoved Lorcan face first into the dirt of Eva's yard. The people of Oakhaven stood in a line. It was a long line. It stretched from the doors of the new mining office, built on the site of Vance's collapsed shaft, reinforced with Lorcan's lateral brace system, the patent-pending design that had been filed in January and approved in March back along the road and around the corner. The people in it wore work aprons. They held hats in their hands. They waited their turn, and when they reached the window, they received their weekly pay envelope from the bookkeeper inside. Eva had hired the bookkeeper. She had hired most of the staff, in fact, working through a set of criteria she had developed herself: fair dealing, willingness to learn, and a complete absence of any prior employment by Senator Thaddeus Vance. This last requirement had left some positions harder to fill than others. Oakhaven was a small town, and Vance had employed a great many people, directly or indirectly, for a long time. She had filled those positions anyway. It just took until April. The market ran 6 days a week now, managed almost entirely by Bo, who had taken to accounting with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. He was 12 years old, and he balanced ledgers with a precision that made the Chicago firm's accountant remark, in his last letter, that he hoped to meet the young man one day and shake his hand. Bo had read this letter 3 times, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket, where it stayed. Naomi had started teaching the cooking class on Thursday afternoons. 6 women came, then 8, then 12. She was 13. She stood at the front of Eva's kitchen with a calm authority and a talent for explaining proportions in ways that made immediate sense, and nobody who attended thought it remarkable that she was young or that she was the one teaching. She was the one who knew. The schoolroom remained in constant use. Eva had begun teaching reading to adults in the evenings, miners' wives mostly, and 2 of the miners themselves. Men who had lived their whole working lives unable to read the contracts they signed. She taught the same way she did everything, without ceremony, without condescension, starting from exactly where people were and moving forward from there. Within 6 months, the evening class had grown to 18 students. She had to move it to the larger room. Lorcan had implemented 2 policies at the mine that had produced, initially, considerable resistance. The first was an 8-hour workday. Not 12, not 10, 8, with a guaranteed rest period at midday and a formal rotation system to prevent the exhaustion-related errors that caused most accidents underground. The second was an injury fund, a small percentage of each week's operating profit, set aside to cover medical costs and partial wages for any miner unable to work due to an on-site injury. It was, as far as anyone could determine, the first such fund operated by a private mine in the territory. The resistance had faded when the men understood that these were not charitable gestures. They were engineering decisions. A rested worker makes better decisions. A worker who knows his family will be provided for if he's hurt will descend into a shaft with a steadier mind. The math was straightforward. Lorcan presented it as math because that was what it was, and people argued with math less than they argued with kindness. The Vance matter had concluded quietly. No trial, the evidence was sufficient, and the associated scandal sufficient beyond that, and Vance had accepted a negotiated resolution that stripped him of his holdings and his office and left him with enough to live on, provided he lived plainly. He had left Oakhaven in March, and Eva did not know where he had gone and did not spend time thinking about it. What she spent time thinking about was the homestead as it stood now, the main cabin, the machine shop, the schoolroom, the garden, which had given more than she'd projected this year. The ridge behind it all, where extraction had been proceeding on schedule since May, exactly as Lorcan had mapped it in those 12 pages of technical notation written by lamplight in the ruins of a wrecked food store. She was thinking about all of this on the evening of the anniversary, sitting on the front steps in the October light, watching the hills go gold when Lorcan came out and positioned himself beside her. They had been married in June. It had been a very small ceremony. Bo and Naomi, the law firm representative who handled the paperwork. A minister from the next county whom Eva had written to because she did not trust anyone in Oakhaven to do anything in good faith. It had taken 30 minutes, and it had been, without question, the best 30 minutes of her life. The wedding night had been quiet and careful and true, and in the morning the world looked the same, and also completely different, which is the only way real things work. Lorcan looked out at the October hills. "A year ago today," he said. "I know," she said. "Declan thought he was insulting both of us." "He was," she said. "He just miscalculated what we'd do with the insult." Lorcan was quiet for a moment. The light moved across the ridge. In the distance, the faint sound of the mine's evening shift bell carried on the air, the one that signaled the end of the 8-hour day, the one that sent men home to their families at a reasonable hour. "They thought they gave you a broken man," he said, "and gave me a discarded widow." She looked at him. "But we gave each other true love," she said, "and together. We built an empire of dignity," he said. She smiled. Not the careful smile she had learned to use in Oakhaven, the one that gave nothing away, the real one. The one that had taken a year to fully come back, and that Lorcan had never once tried to rush. Inside, Bo and Naomi were arguing cheerfully about something, probably the ledger, or the lesson plan, or the correct way to make cornbread, which was a recurring debate. The argument had no heat in it. It was the argument of people who know they're safe. Listened to it for a moment, and then looked back at the ridge, golden in the October light, holding all that iron in its patient dark earth. They had started with 40 acres, and a man face down in the dirt, and a town full of people who had written them both off before either of them had said a word. They had done the math differently, and the math had turned out to be right. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it isn't romance. It isn't even the land or the iron or the money, though all of that matters. It's a single stubborn idea that the value of a human being has nothing to do with what the world decides to do with them. Lorcan was dropped in the dirt, literally dropped. Shoved off a wagon by a man who wanted to use him as a weapon against a woman. Because that's what men like Declan do. They turn other people's pain into tools. And Eva was supposed to be humiliated by it. She was supposed to look at this broken, filthy, paralyzed stranger and feel burdened, feel diminished, feel like the town had won another small, cruel victory over her. Instead, she knelt down in the dirt beside him and asked if he could push with his arms. That moment is the whole story. Everything else, the ore, the patents, the Chicago letter, the rifle shot in the dark, The iron-wheeled chair, the schoolroom, the empire, all of it grows from that one decision. The decision to see a person, not as a problem, not as a symbol, not as a burden. Just a human being who needed a hand up and deserved to be asked plainly. We live in a world that is very good at deciding who counts. It decides based on what you can do, what you look like, how you move through a room, whether you need help or whether you give it. Lorcan couldn't walk. Eva was a widow in a town that had already written her obituary in gossip long before she died. Neither of them fit the category of person that the Vances of the world consider worth taking seriously. And that was the miscalculation that cost Vance everything, because worth isn't assigned by the powerful. It exists independently of them. It always has. Lorcan's mind was worth more than Vance's entire operation. Eva's courage was worth more than every deed in the county recorder's office. Beau's instinct for fairness was worth more than a dozen men who'd had every advantage. Naomi's name on that chalkboard meant more than anything Vance had ever put his signature to. None of that value came from permission. None of it was granted by anyone. It was there the whole time, waiting for circumstances that would let it be seen. That's the real lesson here, and it's an old one, but it bears repeating because the world keeps forgetting it. People who have been discarded are not damaged goods. They are people who have survived being discarded, which is an entirely different thing and considerably harder. The experience of being underestimated, dismissed, labeled, and thrown away does not subtract from a person. In some ways, not in any way that makes the suffering worth it, but in some real, observable way, it sharpens them. It teaches them to read situations clearly because they've never had the luxury of reading them wrong. It teaches them to build with what they have, because no one was going to hand them anything better. Eva learned that alone on 40 acres. Lorcan learned it in the months after Montana. What they built together was the direct product of everything that had been done to them, and everything they had refused to let that make them. The town of Oak Haven stood in line at the end, aprons on, hats in hand, waiting for paychecks from the people they had mocked and discarded and gossiped about and tried to destroy. That's not revenge. That's just the long game playing out. That's what happens when you keep building while other people are busy tearing things down. If this story gives you anything to carry out of it, let it be this. The people around you who have been written off by circumstance, by injury, by loss, by the particular cruelty of small towns and small minds are not liabilities. Pay attention to them, because the ones who've had to rebuild from nothing usually know exactly how things are put together. And the ones who've been told they don't matter have often spent a very long time getting very clear on the fact that they do. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental.